Richard Davenport, CEO of Ethelgard Innovations North America, stood on the marble terrace of his sprawling estate, a crystal flute of champagne held aloft. The setting sun cast a golden, syrupy light over the manicured lawns, glinting off the jewelry of the 50 or so family members gathered for the annual Davenport reunion. He was a man carved from privilege, his posture ramrod straight, his smile a carefully calibrated instrument of condescension. He believed he was at the absolute pinnacle of his world, a king surveying his prosperous domain. He didn't know that his world was a gilded cage built on a foundation of sand. He didn't know that the quiet, unassuming man his daughter had married, the man he was about to publicly ridicule, was the sole heir to the entire Ethelgard global empire, a titan of industry with a valuation of $27 billion. Within 3 hours, Richard Davenport's world would be systematically dismantled, piece by gilded, fragile piece. We've all felt underestimated at some point, haven't we? Judged by our appearance, our job title, or the car we drive. It's a bitter pill to swallow. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, as we witness just how catastrophically wrong the Davenports were about their son-in-law. And if you enjoy seeing arrogance meet its match, be sure to like and subscribe, because this is just the beginning of a story about the quiet power that lies hidden within us all. Liam Wallace felt the collective gaze of the Davenport clan settle upon him as Richard cleared his throat, a theatrical sound designed to command attention. Liam stood beside his wife, Chloe, slightly behind her, a position he had learned to occupy at these gatherings. It made him a smaller target. Beside him, Chloe shifted her weight, the silk of her dress whispering in the otherwise silent anticipation. She knew what was coming. It was a family tradition, after all, Richard's annual roast, which was less about humor and more about reinforcing the family hierarchy. Liam was always at the bottom. "To family," Richard began, his voice booming with false sincerity. "To the Davenport legacy, a legacy of strength, ambition, and success. I look at my son Mark, a vice president at 32, and I see that strength." Mark, a broader, cruder version of his father, puffed out his chest and raised his glass. "I look at my brilliant wife, Eleanor, the bedrock of this family, and I see that ambition." Eleanor, draped in diamonds that seemed to drain the light from around her, offered a regal, icy smile. "And I look at my beautiful daughter, Chloe." Richard paused, letting his gaze drift from Chloe to Liam, his smile tightening into a smirk. "And I see a generous heart, a truly, truly generous heart." A wave of tittering laughter rippled through the crowd. The insult was clear. A perfectly polished dagger slid between the ribs. Chloe had been generous enough to marry down, to bring someone like Liam into their rarefied world. Liam's face remained a placid mask, his eyes calm and observant. He gave Chloe's hand a gentle squeeze, a silent message. "I'm okay." But she wasn't. He could feel the tremor in her fingers, the shame radiating from her in waves. She loved him, he knew that. But she was also a product of this environment, a gilded bird terrified of flying too far from the cage she knew. Her silence was her shield, but every time she used it, it became a small betrayal. The humiliation had started the moment they'd arrived. They had pulled up the long, winding driveway in Liam's modest but reliable sedan, a car that looked like a dinghy docking next to a fleet of yachts. The valets, accustomed to German luxury cars and Italian sports models, had almost smirked as they took his keys. Eleanor had greeted them at the door, her eyes sweeping over Liam's well-made but off-the-rack suit with a flicker of disdain. "Liam," she had said, her voice as crisp as a starched napkin. "How practical of you to dress so sensibly." She kissed the air beside his cheek before turning to her daughter. "Chloe, darling, you look divine. That color is wonderful on you. We must find you a better jeweler, though. That little necklace is sweet." The necklace was a birthday gift from Liam, a simple, elegant piece from a local artisan he admired. He had seen the joy in Chloe's eyes when she'd opened it that morning. Now he watched as her hand instinctively went to her throat, her fingers covering the delicate silver chain as if to hide it from her mother's corrosive judgment. Later, as guests mingled, Liam found himself being cornered by Mark and a few of his cousins. Mark, holding a glass of scotch that probably cost more than Liam's suit, clapped him on the back with enough force to be aggressive. "Liam, my man," Mark boomed, "still playing with your little blueprints? Still designing? What is it this time? A dentist's office? A modest suburban home?" "An urban renewal project, actually," Liam replied, his voice even. "A community library and public green space." Mark exchanged a look with his cousin, a carbon copy of himself in a slightly different shade of entitlement. "A library? How noble, and how unprofitable." They laughed, a harsh, braying sound. "Listen, I keep telling you, the offer's still on the table. We've always got room in the mailroom at Ethelgard. You'd have to sort my mail, of course, but think of the benefits. A real career path." The offer was a running joke, one Richard had made years ago and Mark had gleefully adopted. It was their way of constantly reminding him of his station, of the immense, unbridgeable gulf between his world and theirs. Liam simply smiled, a small, private smile that they misinterpreted as weakness, as acquiescence. They couldn't see the steel behind it. They didn't know he was the nephew of Beatrice Ethelgard, the reclusive, fiercely private genius who had built the company from nothing. They didn't know that every insult, every condescending remark was being catalogued, filed away in a mind that was as precise and structured as the buildings he designed. In his inner jacket pocket, he could feel the familiar weight of his leather-bound journal. To anyone else, it was just a sketchbook, but to him, it was a repository of ideas, a conversation with his aunt that had spanned a decade. It contained sketches, yes, but it also held strategic plans, notes on personnel, and a detailed blueprint for the future of Ethelgard Innovations. A future that had no place for the arrogant, complacent men standing before him. He touched the worn leather through the fabric of his suit, a silent promise to his aunt, and to himself, that change was coming. He just had to be patient. The Davenports, in their blindness, were doing most of the work for him. They were handing him all the justification he would ever need. And as Richard raised his glass on the terrace, preparing to launch into his main assault, Liam knew the wait was almost over. The foundation was about to crack. The dinner that followed was an exercise in calculated exclusion. The main table, a long, ornate affair of polished mahogany, was reserved for the core family. Richard sat at the head, a modern-day patriarch presiding over his court. Liam, however, was relegated to a smaller, circular table near the French doors, a collection of distant cousins and the teenage children of business associates. It was the adult equivalent of the kids' table, a clear and deliberate signal of his status. Chloe had protested, a quiet, pleading look directed at her mother. "Mother, there's room at the main table. Liam should sit with me." Eleanor had waved a dismissive hand, her diamond bracelets catching the light. "Don't be silly, darling. The seating arrangement is perfect. It's important for Liam to get to know the extended family. Besides, you know how your father likes to talk business at dinner. We wouldn't want to bore him." The implication was clear. Liam was not important enough to be included in real conversation. He was an outsider, a guest on sufferance. Chloe had relented, casting a helpless, apologetic glance at Liam as a stern-looking waiter guided him to his designated seat. The physical distance between them was a chasm, a perfect metaphor for the emotional space her family constantly tried to force between them. From his vantage point, Liam had a clear view of the main table. He watched as Richard held court, his voice a low rumble of self-importance. He saw Mark regaling his sycophantic cousins with tales of a ruthless corporate takeover. He saw Eleanor subtly directing the staff with the flick of an eye, a master of domestic tyranny. And he saw Chloe, picking at her food, her laughter forced, her smiles brittle. She was trying to belong to two worlds, and the strain was beginning to show. At his own table, the conversation was inane. The teenagers were absorbed in their phones, while the distant cousins attempted to one-up each other with stories of their recent European holidays. One of them, a woman named Patricia, finally turned to Liam. "And what is it you do again, Liam?" she asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer was unimpressive. "I'm an architect," he said simply. "Oh, that's nice," she replied, the vocal equivalent of a pat on the head. "My husband and I just had our summer home in the Hamptons redesigned. A massive project. We used Jean-Pierre Dubois. You've probably heard of him? He's terribly exclusive." Liam had heard of him. Dubois was known for creating opulent, soulless monuments to new money. "His work is very distinct," Liam offered, the most neutral comment he could muster. "Distinct! I love that," Patricia chirped, missing the nuance entirely. "It's so hard to find good people, isn't it? People with real vision. Most are just glorified draftsmen, really." The barb, though likely unintentional, landed close to Mark's earlier insult. It was the prevailing attitude of this family. Unless your work generated obscene profits and garnered public acclaim, it was little more than a hobby. Liam's internal monologue began to hum, a low-frequency analysis of the scene before him. He wasn't angry. Anger was a hot, imprecise emotion. What he felt was a cold, crystalline clarity. He was an anthropologist observing a tribe on the verge of extinction. He remembered a conversation with his Aunt Beatrice a few months prior. They were in her modest, book-filled study, a room that smelled of old paper and Earl Grey tea. It was a world away from the Davenports' ostentatious mansion. Beatrice, a woman whose quiet demeanor belied a mind of formidable power, had been looking over a quarterly report from the North American division. "There's a rot in the leadership, Liam," she had said, her finger tapping on a page of inflated expense reports. "A sense of entitlement. They think the company exists to serve them, not the other way around. They've grown complacent, fat, and slow. They've forgotten the first principle of everything we built: integrity." She had looked at him then, her gaze sharp and penetrating. "When you take over, you will have to be the surgeon. You will have to cut deep to save the patient. It won't be pleasant." "I know, Aunt B," he had replied. "You will face resistance," she continued, "especially from those who benefit most from the current system. They will underestimate you. They will see your quiet nature as weakness, your humility as a lack of ambition. Let them. An enemy who misunderstands you is an enemy who has already lost." He looked across the room at Richard Davenport, a man who perfectly embodied the rot his aunt had described. Richard believed his position was a birthright, a reward for his name and his connections. He had no idea that his performance, his entire career, had been monitored for years by the very woman he privately dismissed as an eccentric old recluse who was lucky to have him running her company. Chloe caught his eye from the main table. Her expression was a storm of conflicting emotions: pity for his isolation, shame for her own inaction, a desperate plea for his understanding. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. It had to be enough for now. He knew this was harder for her than it was for him. He was anchored by a truth they couldn't see. She was adrift in a sea of loyalty, torn between the family that raised her and the man she had chosen to build a life with. He did not resent her for her struggle, but he knew, with the certainty of a structural engineer examining a failing beam, that it couldn't last. A choice would have to be made. The pressure was building, and tonight something was going to break. He turned his attention back to his bland risotto, eating slowly, methodically, conserving his energy. The main event, Richard's speech, was yet to come. After the dessert plates were cleared, a subtle shift occurred in the atmosphere. The low hum of conversation quieted as Richard Davenport rose from his seat, tapping a spoon gently against his crystal glass. A hush fell over the terrace. This was the moment Richard lived for. the culmination of the evening, where he could solidify his position as the undisputed head of the family through a display of rhetorical power. "If I could have your attention, everyone," he began, his voice resonating with practiced authority. He beamed at his family, a benevolent monarch addressing his loyal subjects. "Another year, another wonderful gathering. It fills my heart with pride to look out at all of you, to see the success, the prosperity. We are Davenports. That name means something. It stands for excellence, for a commitment to being the best." He launched into a familiar speech, weaving a narrative of family legacy and corporate triumph. He spoke of his grandfather, who had founded a small manufacturing business, and how he, Richard, had honored that legacy by rising through the ranks of a global powerhouse like Ethelgard Innovations. He conveniently omitted the fact that his initial entry into the company was due to a college roommate's father who sat on the board, and that his promotions had been more a product of corporate politics than actual merit. In Richard's telling, his story was a heroic saga of ambition and achievement. Liam listened, his expression neutral. He had heard variations of this speech for the past 5 years, ever since he had married Chloe. It was always the same self-congratulatory tale, but tonight he sensed a different edge to it. Richard seemed more arrogant than usual, more secure in his position. He had recently closed a major deal, a fact he had made sure everyone was aware of, and the success had inflated his already considerable ego to dangerous proportions. "Success isn't just about what we achieve for ourselves," Richard continued, his gaze sweeping the crowd before landing, with pinpoint accuracy, on Liam. "It's about the company we keep. It's about ensuring the family name continues to be associated with strength." He paused, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "And that's why I want to take a moment to acknowledge our dear Liam." A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the audience. Chloe stiffened beside him, her hand balling into a fist in her lap. "Now, Liam here is an architect," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension. He made the words sound like unemployed artist. "He builds things, small things, I imagine, quaint things. While we at Ethelgard are building the future, Liam is, well, he's probably designing a very lovely garden shed somewhere." More laughter, louder this time. Mark hooted with glee. Liam felt a familiar coldness settle in his gut, but he did not let it show. Instead, his mind began to scroll through a list, a mental catalog of grievances he had kept since joining this family. He remembered their first Christmas together, when Richard and Eleanor had given him a book titled Dressing for Success, a passive-aggressive critique of his personal style. He remembered the dinner party where Richard, after a few too many glasses of wine, had offered him condescending career advice, suggesting he give up his little design hobby and get a real job in finance. He remembered the countless times his own achievements, winning a prestigious design award, being featured in an architectural journal, were met with polite disinterest, while Mark's most minor corporate promotion was celebrated with lavish parties. The most galling memory was from 2 years ago. Liam's small firm had hit a rough patch. One of his business partners had made some poor financial decisions, and Liam was working tirelessly to keep the company afloat. He had made the mistake of confiding in Chloe, who, in a moment of concern, had mentioned it to her father. A week later, Richard had called him into his study. He had sat behind his enormous desk, a picture of smug magnanimity, and offered Liam a job. Not an executive position, but an entry-level logistics coordinator role at an Ethelgard warehouse an hour outside the city. "It's honest work, Liam," Richard had said, steepling his fingers. "It's not glamorous, but it would give you stability, a steady paycheck. You have to think of Chloe. You can't support my daughter on dreams and blueprints." The offer was a profound insult, a calculated move to emasculate him and prove his inadequacy. Liam had politely declined, explaining that he was committed to his firm and his partners. Richard had simply shaken his head with a look of pity. A noble sentiment, he'd sighed, but nobility doesn't pay the mortgage. Liam had never told Richard that 2 days after that conversation, he had secured a massive new commission that saved his firm and set it on a path to unprecedented success. He had never told him that the seed money for his firm had come from an inheritance left to him by his parents, and that his Aunt Beatrice had quietly acted as a financial advisor, helping him invest it wisely, resulting in a personal net worth that the Davenports couldn't even fathom. He let them believe he was struggling. He let them have their narrative. Now on the terrace, Richard was nearing the climax of his diatribe. "So let's raise a glass," he declared, his voice full of mock generosity. "To Liam, for showing us that ambition comes in all shapes and sizes, even very, very small ones." The family roared with laughter. It was the cruelest cut yet, delivered on a public stage for maximum effect. Liam felt Chloe flinch as if she had been struck. He reached into his jacket and his fingers brushed against the smooth, worn leather of his journal. Inside, tucked into a flap, was a folded letter. It was a handwritten note from his aunt, delivered by courier that morning. It contained only one sentence. "Tonight, my boy, show them what a real legacy looks like." He took a slow, deep breath. The quiet before the storm was officially over. The applause for Richard's speech was a wave of familial validation, washing over the terrace and leaving Liam feeling utterly adrift. He was an island, isolated in a sea of their shared arrogance. He saw Chloe's face, pale and stricken in the twilight, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked at him, her mouth opening as if to say something, but no words came out. The years of intimidation had stolen her voice when she needed it most. Without a word, Liam turned and walked away from the crowd. He pushed open one of the heavy glass doors and stepped onto a secluded veranda that overlooked the vast, immaculately sculpted gardens. The air here was cooler, fragrant with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. The sound of the party faded behind him, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the ancient oak trees. He leaned against the stone balustrade, the cold seeping through the fabric of his suit, and looked out at the darkness. The Davenport estate was a monument to excess. It was beautiful, undeniably, but it was a sterile, curated beauty. Every hedge was perfectly trimmed, every flower bed arranged in a rigid, geometric pattern. It was a garden that left no room for nature's own design, much like the family that owned it left no room for anyone who didn't fit their rigid mold. Liam preferred the wild, untamed beauty of the countryside surrounding his aunt's home, a place where things were allowed to grow as they were meant to. A few moments later, he heard the soft click of the door opening and closing behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Chloe. He felt her presence, a mixture of shame and frantic energy. She came to stand beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if to ward off a chill that wasn't there. For a long time they stood in silence, two separate figures staring into the same darkness. The tension between them was a palpable thing, a third presence on the veranda. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice tight and brittle. "Why do you let them do that?" she asked, her words barely a whisper. "Why do you just stand there and take it?" Liam continued to look out at the garden. "What would you have me do, Chloe? Make a scene? Get into a shouting match with your father? You could say something, anything. Defend yourself." Her voice cracked with frustration. "You just let them walk all over you. You let them treat you like you're nothing." He turned then, his calm demeanor finally showing a hairline fracture of the immense pressure he was under. His eyes, usually so gentle and patient, held a new intensity. "Do I?" he asked, his voice low and even. "Or am I simply letting them show me exactly who they are, without any doubt or ambiguity?" Chloe recoiled slightly, taken aback by his tone. "What is that supposed to mean? They're my family, Liam." "Yes, they are," he acknowledged. "And I am your husband. A choice has to be made eventually about where your loyalty lies. You cannot stand with one foot in each world forever. Sooner or later, you will be torn apart. Tears welled in her eyes. That's not fair. You don't understand what it's like. The pressure, the expectations. I think I understand better than you know, he said, his voice softening slightly. He saw the genuine pain in her face, the turmoil of a person caught in an impossible situation. I'm not asking you to disown them, Chloe. I'm asking you to stand with me, to be my partner, to let them know that when they attack me, they are attacking you too. I try, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. But I freeze up. It's like I'm a little girl again, and I'm so afraid of his disappointment. Liam reached out and took her hand. It was cold. I know, but you're not a little girl anymore. You're a strong, intelligent woman, stronger than you think. As he spoke, a new sound began to intrude upon the quiet night. It started as a faint, rhythmic chopping in the distance, a sound that was completely out of place in the serene atmosphere of the party. It grew steadily louder, a percussive beat that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Whoomp, 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 whoomp. Chloe looked up, her brow furrowed in confusion. What is that? Liam's expression was unreadable. He looked up at the night sky, his gaze fixed on a point beyond the trees. That, he said, his voice calm and steady, is the sound of change. Back on the main terrace, the party had devolved into confused murmurs. The rhythmic thumping was now impossible to ignore. Richard Davenport's face was a mask of thunderous fury. He had been in the middle of a self-aggrandizing story, and this unwelcome interruption had stolen his audience. What in God's name is that racket? He bellowed to no one in particular. Suddenly, powerful landing lights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the lawn and illuminating the house in a brilliant, sterile glare. The sound was deafening now, a physical force that rattled the windows. A sleek, dark helicopter, an Augusta Westland AW-139, was descending towards the estate's private helipad, a feature Richard had installed for great expense and rarely used, except to impress potential business partners. Who the devil would dare land on my property without permission? Richard snarled, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He stormed towards the edge of the terrace, Mark trailing behind him like a loyal bulldog. The helicopter touched down with a final, powerful gust of wind that sent napkins flying and made the guests shield their faces. The engines began to wind down, and the rotor blades slowly spun to a halt. A profound silence descended, more jarring than the noise it replaced. A door on the side of the aircraft slid open, and a set of stairs unfolded. Richard and Mark marched across the lawn, their shoes sinking into the perfectly manicured grass. They were ready to unleash their fury upon whoever had so brazenly interrupted their evening. Richard was already rehearsing his scathing tirade. The first person to emerge was a man in his late 60s, tall and distinguished, with a mane of silver hair and an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and moved with a grace that belied his age. Richard stopped in his tracks, his anger instantly evaporating and being replaced by a confused, fawning deference. "Mr. Harrison?" he stammered. "Arthur Harrison?" It was him, the most senior member of the Ethelgard Innovations Board of Directors, Beatrice Ethelgard's most trusted advisor and oldest friend. He was a legend within the company, a man who commanded more respect than any CEO. "Harrison, what an unexpected pleasure," Richard said, recovering quickly and extending a hand. His mind was racing. Harrison's presence here could only mean one thing. He had come personally to congratulate Richard on the recent deal, perhaps even to hint at a major promotion, a seat on the global board. It was the ultimate validation. But Arthur Harrison did not take his hand. His gaze, sharp and cold as glacial ice, swept past Richard and Mark as if they were pieces of furniture. He was followed down the steps by two other people, a man and a woman in severe business attire, carrying sleek leather briefcases. They looked like high-powered corporate lawyers, which is exactly what they were. Harrison's eyes scanned the crowd on the terrace, his expression impassive. He was looking for someone. Richard, flustered by being ignored, tried again. "Arthur, this is a surprise. We're having a small family get-together. You must join us for a drink." Harrison's gaze finally settled, his focus locking onto the veranda at the side of the house. He saw the two figures standing there, bathed in the soft light from the doorway. Ignoring Richard's sputtering attempts at conversation completely, Arthur Harrison began to walk, his stride purposeful and direct, straight across the lawn. He walked past the stunned Davenports, past the bewildered guests, his path unwavering. He walked directly to the veranda where Liam and Chloe stood. He stopped before them and inclined his head respectfully. The entire party watched, frozen in a state of collective disbelief. The power dynamic of the evening had just been shattered into a million pieces. "Liam," Arthur Harrison said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the silent lawn. "Beatrice sent us." He paused, his eyes meeting Liam's with a look of profound significance. "She said it was time." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. On the lawn, Richard Davenport's jaw hung open, his face a canvas of utter bewilderment. Eleanor, standing on the terrace, brought a hand to her mouth, her diamonds suddenly looking cheap and gaudy in the harsh glare of the helicopter's lights. Mark just stared, his brain struggling to process a reality that simply did not compute. The quiet, pathetic architect they had been mocking all night was on a first-name basis with Arthur Harrison, the right hand of Beatrice Aethelgard herself. Liam nodded slowly to Mr. Harrison, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He took Chloe's hand, which was now trembling uncontrollably, and led her from the veranda onto the lawn. As they walked towards the center of the gathering, the crowd parted for them as if Liam were royalty. The whispers were frantic, a nervous buzz of confusion and speculation. Mr. Harrison and his legal team fell into step beside Liam. Harrison turned to address the stunned assembly, his voice projecting a natural authority that Richard, for all his blustering, could never hope to match. "Good evening," Harrison began, his tone formal and unyielding. "My apologies for the intrusion. My name is Arthur Harrison, senior board member and personal counsel to Miss Beatrice Aethelgard, the founder and sole majority shareholder of Aethelgard Innovations." He let the name hang in the air. While the family knew they worked for Aethelgard, Beatrice herself was a near mythical figure. She was famously reclusive, never giving interviews or appearing in public. Most employees, even high-level executives like Richard, had never met her, interacting only through proxies like Harrison. "I am here tonight on Miss Aethelgard's direct orders to make an important announcement regarding the future of the company." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to a dawning, sickening horror. This was not a social call. This was an official proceeding. "Effective as of 9 o'clock this evening," Harrison continued, "Miss Beatrice Aethelgard has officially entered into her retirement. She has transferred her entire controlling interest in the company into a family trust." A gasp went through the crowd. This was monumental news, the kind that would send shockwaves through the financial world. "Her successor," Harrison said, his voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, "has already been chosen. It is a decision she has been preparing for over a decade." Richard took an involuntary step forward, his face a mess of hope and dread. Could it be him? Had his years of service finally been recognized? Harrison's next words obliterated that hope. "Ms. Aethelgard has always believed that legacy is not about blood, but about character and vision. Her chosen heir is the only person she trusts to carry her vision into the future, the only person who understands the core principles upon which she built her empire." He then turned and looked directly at Liam. But his words were for the Davenports, for Eleanor, whose mind was frantically trying to connect the dots. "Many of you know Ms. Aethelgard by her professional name, but her family name, the name she was born with, is Wallace. Beatrice Wallace. Eleanor made a small, strangled sound. Wallace. Liam Wallace. The connection was impossible, and yet undeniable. The quiet, unassuming boy her daughter had brought home was related to the invisible monarch of their entire world. Richard's face had gone from red to a ghostly white. His entire body seemed to shrink, the arrogant posture collapsing in on itself as the terrible truth dawned on him. Harrison delivered the final, devastating blow. His voice was calm, almost matter-of-fact, which only made the announcement more powerful. Per the explicit and legally binding instructions of Miss Beatrice Aethelgard Wallace, I am here to announce her successor. Effective immediately, the new chairman and acting CEO of the global Aethelgard Innovations conglomerate is her nephew and her chosen heir, Mr. Liam Wallace. Silence. A profound, absolute silence fell over the lawn, broken only by the faint, distant sound of crickets. The quiet bomb had landed, and the fallout was total. Liam stepped forward, leaving a stunned Chloe by his side. He no longer looked like the humble architect they had ridiculed. In the stark light, his calm demeanor now projected an aura of immense power. He reached into his jacket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out the worn, leather-bound journal. He held it not as a shield, but as a symbol of his authority. He opened it to a marked page. The time for patience was over. The time for accountability had begun. Liam's eyes, clear and steady, swept across the frozen faces of the Davenport family. There was no triumph in his gaze, no hint of gloating. There was only a profound, almost sorrowful gravity. He was not a conqueror savoring a victory. He was a surgeon preparing to make a necessary, painful incision. He looked first at Richard, who stood as if turned to stone, his champagne flute still clutched in his hand, a pathetic remnant of a celebration that had turned into a public execution. "You spoke of legacy tonight, Richard," Liam began, his voice quiet but carrying with an unnatural clarity in the shocked silence. "You spoke of strength and success, but true legacy isn't built on stock prices and corporate takeovers. It's built on integrity. It's a foundation, and the foundation you built your career on is corrupt." Richard flinched as if struck. "Now see here," he started, his voice a weak, sputtering version of its former boom. Liam held up a hand, and Richard fell silent. The power dynamic had been so completely inverted that a simple gesture from Liam now held more authority than all of Richard's blustering. "You stood on this terrace and you mocked my work," Liam continued, his voice as precise as a scalpel. "You called it small time. You joked about garden sheds." He flipped a page in his journal, revealing a stunningly detailed architectural drawing. "This is a preliminary design for the new Aethelgard Sustainable Technology Campus in Singapore, a $3 billion project that will serve as the company's centerpiece for the next 50 years. My small-time design was personally approved by my aunt 6 months ago. It will be my first official act as CEO to break ground." He then turned his gaze to Mark, whose face was a mixture of disbelief and terror. "Mark, you offered me a job in the mailroom tonight. You mocked my car. You told me nobility doesn't pay the mortgage." Liam's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "The car I drive is a 10-year-old sedan. It's the exact same model my Aunt Beatrice drove for 20 years, long after she could have afforded any car on earth. She believed that a person's worth is measured by their character, not by their possessions. A lesson you have clearly failed to learn. As for the mortgage, my firm, which you so casually dismissed, cleared a net profit of 8 figures last year. I don't have a mortgage." Every word was a perfectly aimed shot, a truth that exposed their shallow, materialistic worldview. He was using their own insults, their own prejudices, and turning them into mirrors, forcing them to see the ugliness of their own reflections. This was the moral mirror, and it was devastating. Eleanor, seeing the complete collapse of her husband and son, made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. She glided forward, her face arranged in a mask of shocked, delighted surprise. "Liam, dear," she cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "We never knew. My goodness, a secret billionaire in the family. Why didn't you say anything? We are so, so proud of you." Liam's gaze fell upon her, and for the first time a flicker of genuine coldness entered his eyes. "You never knew because you never asked, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. "You never once asked about my family. You never asked about my parents, who were her beloved brother and sister-in-law. You never showed the slightest interest in who I was. You were only interested in what you thought I was, someone beneath you. Your pride isn't for me, it's for my new title, and it means nothing." Eleanor froze, her sycophantic smile collapsing. He had seen straight through her, to the hollow, status-obsessed core. She was exposed, and she had no defense. Finally, Liam's eyes found Chloe's. She was standing where he had left her face wet with silent tears. But these were not tears of shame or pity. They were tears of shock, of revelation, and of a dawning, terrifying clarity. She was seeing her husband for the first time, not as the gentle, patient man she loved, but as the powerful, formidable man he had been all along. And she was seeing her family for what they truly were: cruel, petty, and shallow. Richard, snapping out of his stupor, made one last pathetic appeal. He turned to his daughter, his voice pleading. "Chloe, sweetheart, talk to your husband. This is all a terrible misunderstanding, a joke in poor taste. That's all it was. We love Liam. Tell him." This was it, the moment of truth. The choice she had been avoiding for 5 years was now laid bare before her, before everyone. She could side with the family that had raised her in luxury and cruelty, or she could stand with the husband who had borne their insults with quiet dignity, who had protected her from a truth he knew would hurt her. For a heart-stopping second she hesitated. Then her back straightened. The fear and uncertainty in her eyes were replaced by a look of fierce, unwavering resolve. She walked across the grass, her steps sure and steady. She didn't stop until she was standing right beside Liam. She reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. She then turned to face her father, her voice clear and strong, ringing with a conviction no one in her family had ever heard from her before. "No, Dad," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "There's no misunderstanding. I understand perfectly now." She squeezed Liam's hand. "I'm with my husband." The secondary conflict, the crack in the foundation of their marriage, was sealed. In that moment, they were not two separate people from two different worlds. They were a single, unbreakable unit. Mr. Harrison, who had been watching the entire exchange with a grim satisfaction, nodded to his legal team. The woman stepped forward and opened her briefcase. She produced 2 thick, pristine white envelopes. She walked over to Richard and handed him one. Then she handed the other to Mark. "What is this?" Richard asked, his hand trembling as he took the envelope. "Your services are not being terminated, Mr. Davenport," Mr. Harrison said, his voice laced with ice. "That would be too simple. Instead, Mr. Wallace has decided that your positions and the entire North American division are to be placed under immediate and comprehensive review. You are both suspended, effective now, pending the results of a full forensic audit, which Mr. Wallace will personally oversee." The poetic justice was exquisite. The men who had deemed Liam unworthy of even a seat at their table were now having their entire professional lives placed in his hands. Their fate, their careers, their vaunted legacy, all of it now depended on the mercy of the man they had spent years trying to humiliate. Richard looked down at the envelope, then up at Liam, his eyes wide with a terror that was profoundly satisfying to every guest who had witnessed his cruelty. The king had been deposed, and his crown was now in the hands of the man he had dismissed as a court jester. The new reign had begun. The immediate aftermath was a scene of quiet, chaotic disintegration. The party was over. Guests began to depart in a hurry, murmuring amongst themselves, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the Davenports' public downfall. They avoided looking at Richard or Eleanor, treating them as if they were suddenly contagious. The social currency the Davenports had wielded for so long had just been rendered worthless. Richard stood frozen on the lawn, the suspension letter clutched in his fist, his knuckles white. His mind, usually so sharp and calculating when it came to business, was a fog of denial and panic. He kept looking from Liam to Arthur Harrison, as if expecting one of them to suddenly burst out laughing and declare it all an elaborate prank. But the stony faces of Harrison's legal team and the quiet, resolute strength emanating from Liam offered no such comfort. Mark was reacting differently. His fear was curdling into a desperate, misplaced rage. "You can't do this," he snarled, taking a step towards Liam. "This is my family's company. We built this division." Before Liam could even respond, Mr. Harrison stepped smoothly between them. Despite being decades older, he had a presence that made Mark halt in his tracks. "Mr. Davenport," Harrison said, his voice dangerously low, "your family has been a custodian, nothing more. You have been handsomely rewarded for that custodianship. But you seem to have forgotten that you do not own the house. Ms. Ethelgard Wallace does, and now Mr. Wallace does. I suggest you read your employment contract very carefully, specifically the clauses regarding insubordination to senior executive leadership." Mark paled, the fight draining out of him instantly. He was a bully who had just run into a wall of absolute authority. He looked to his father for support, but Richard was lost, staring blankly at the perfectly manicured hedge that bordered his property, as if seeing it for the first time. Chloe stayed firmly by Liam's side, her hand a warm, steady presence in his. She was a silent anchor in the storm, her choice made, her loyalty declared. She met the shocked and betrayed stares of her cousins and aunts with a calm defiance that was entirely new. She was no longer just a Davenport, she was a Wallace now, in spirit as well as in name. The legal team efficiently and discreetly began their work, requesting access to Richard's home office. The audit was not a future threat, it was happening now. One of them approached Eleanor, whose composure had shattered into a million tiny pieces. "Mrs. Davenport," the lawyer said politely but firmly, "we will require all financial records related to household and personal expenses that have been claimed through Mr. Davenport's corporate account for the past 10 years. Eleanor looked at the woman with horrified eyes. Her lavish parties, her designer wardrobe, her frequent redecorating, so much of her lifestyle was subsidized by a generous and largely unscrutinized corporate expense account. An account that was about to be examined with a microscope. Liam watched this all unfold with a sense of grim necessity. He felt no joy, only a profound sense of responsibility. This was the rot his aunt had spoken of, and it was his duty to excise it. He turned to Mr. Harrison. "Arthur," he said, his voice steady, "please secure my aunt's assets within the division. Freeze all non-essential spending and suspend all executive bonuses pending the audit's completion. I want a full report on my desk by Monday morning." "It's already in motion, Liam," Harrison replied with a faint, proud smile. "Beatrice gave us our instructions. We were simply waiting for your signal." Liam nodded. He then looked at his wife. "Let's go home, Chloe." "What about them?" she asked, her voice low, nodding towards her broken family. "They have choices to make," Liam said simply. "It's up to them now." As they walked towards Liam's modest sedan, the car Mark had mocked just hours earlier, the remaining family members parted for them. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, fear, and a dawning, sycophantic respect. They were seeing him not as Chloe's quiet husband, but as the new center of their universe, the source of the power and wealth they had for so long taken for granted. Before they reached the car, Eleanor made one last desperate appeal. She hurried after them, her face a mess of tears and ruined makeup. "Chloe, please," she begged, grabbing her daughter's arm. "Don't leave like this. We can fix this. We're family." Chloe gently but firmly removed her mother's hand from her arm. "You had 5 years to treat my husband like family, Mother," she said, her voice full of a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "You chose not to. The consequences of that choice are yours, not ours." With that, she turned and got into the car. Liam gave Eleanor a single, lingering look of profound disappointment before getting into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, the quiet, reliable hum of the sedan sounded more powerful than the roar of any sports car in the driveway. He pulled away from the grand mansion, leaving the Davenports standing amidst the ruins of their own making, a family suddenly and irrevocably diminished, their gilded world exposed as nothing more than a hollow facade. The quiet drive home was the beginning of their new life. The 3 months that followed were a period of seismic change, both personally and professionally. Liam stepped into his role as chairman and CEO of Ethelgard Innovations with a quiet confidence that baffled the old guard and inspired the new. He was not the ruthless corporate raider many had feared, nor was he the weak, indecisive academic some had hoped for. He was a builder. He approached the $27 billion company the same way he approached an architectural project, by first understanding its foundation. He spent his first weeks listening. He met with division heads, engineers, marketers, and even factory floor workers. He walked through research labs and distribution centers, his leather journal always with him, filling its pages with notes and observations. He was learning the structure of his aunt's legacy from the ground up. The audit of the North American division, as he had promised, was swift and mercilessly thorough. It uncovered what Beatrice had called the rot. Years of cronyism, inflated expense accounts, self-serving deals, and a culture of complacency that had been stifling innovation. Richard Davenport's leadership had been a study in mismanagement, masked by the sheer profitability of the company's core products. Richard was not fired in a blaze of glory. Liam afforded him a quiet, unceremonious exit. He was given a generous severance package. His contract demanded it, but he was forced into immediate retirement. The news was spun as a respected veteran leader choosing to step down after a long and storied career. But within the industry, and more importantly, within the family, everyone knew the truth. Richard Davenport had been put out to pasture. He and Eleanor sold their grand estate, a necessity brought on by the sudden cessation of a corporate lifestyle they could no longer afford. They moved into a much smaller, though still luxurious home in a gated community, their world shrinking overnight. Mark's fate was a more direct form of poetic justice. Liam did not fire him. Instead, he transferred him. Mark, the vice president who thrived on the power dynamics of the corporate headquarters, was reassigned to manage a small, underperforming regional distribution center in Omaha, Nebraska. It was a position that required actual work, long hours, and a deep understanding of logistics, skills Mark had never bothered to acquire. He was stripped of his executive title, his expense account, and his team of assistants. For the first time in his life, he was being forced to earn his paycheck. It was a professional exile, a clear message that the age of entitlement at Ethelgard was over. Merit, not name, was the new currency. Liam and Chloe, meanwhile, built a new life for themselves. They moved out of their modest home and purchased a beautiful house on the coast, an hour away from the city. It was a stunning piece of modern architecture, a house Liam had designed himself years ago as a passion project. It was large but not ostentatious, filled with light and natural materials, with wide windows that looked out onto the endless expanse of the ocean. It was a home built for peace, not for show. Their marriage, tested by the fire of Chloe's family, emerged stronger and more honest than ever before. Chloe had apologized deeply and sincerely for her years of silence. She explained the fear and intimidation she had grown up with, not as an excuse, but as a context for her failure to defend him. Liam, in turn, apologized for keeping such a monumental secret from her, explaining that he had been bound by a promise to his aunt, and that he had worried about what such immense wealth and power would do to their relationship. They found a new equilibrium. Chloe, free from her family's suffocating expectations, began to flourish. She enrolled in a university program for art history, a passion she had long suppressed in favor of a more practical career in marketing that her father had pushed her into. She became Liam's most trusted confidant, his sounding board, and his fiercest supporter. She attended corporate functions with him not as a reluctant accessory, but as a proud and equal partner, her insights often proving invaluable. At Ethelgard, Liam's leadership style was revolutionary in its simplicity. He promoted talented people from within the company, regardless of their connections. He invested heavily in research and development, greenlighting innovative and risky projects that Richard had dismissed as unprofitable. He implemented a new code of ethics, tying executive bonuses not just to profit margins, but to employee satisfaction and environmental responsibility. He was transforming the company, strengthening its foundation, and ensuring his aunt's legacy would endure for another generation. He was cutting out the rot, just as she had asked, and in its place, he was building something clean, strong, and designed to last. One crisp autumn afternoon, Liam found himself in the familiar, book-lined study of his Aunt Beatrice's country home. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the scent of old paper and wood smoke filled the air. Beatrice, looking more relaxed and content than Liam had ever seen her, poured them both a cup of Earl Grey tea from a simple ceramic pot. Her retirement agreed with her. "The board is ecstatic, you know," she said, her eyes twinkling over the rim of her teacup. "Profits are up 7% in your first quarter. 7%. Richard was lucky to manage 2% on a good year, and morale has apparently never been higher." Liam smiled. "We're just getting started. The real work is still ahead." "The real work is always ahead," she agreed, "but you've passed the first, most difficult test. You took control, you established your authority, and you did it without becoming a tyrant." She set her cup down and looked at him, her expression turning more serious. "I saw the news about the old Davenport estate being sold. How is Chloe handling it all?" Liam took a sip of his tea, considering the question. "It's been difficult for her," he admitted. "She loves her parents, despite everything. She's grieving the family she thought she had, I think. But she's also free. She's discovering who she is without their influence. It's a beautiful thing to watch." "And Richard? Eleanor? Have you heard from them?" "Eleanor sends Chloe polite, strained text messages once a week. Richard has been silent," Liam said. "I think the humiliation was too much for his pride to bear." "Pride," Beatrice scoffed gently. "It's a useless emotion, a stone that people tie around their own necks and then wonder why they're drowning." She paused, her gaze thoughtful. "You were right not to destroy him, Liam. Vengeance is a shallow victory. Correction, accountability, those have lasting power." Liam nodded, looking into the fire. He had thought a great deal about this. He hadn't sought to ruin the Davenports. He had sought to protect his aunt's legacy and to establish a new, healthier order. His actions had been a consequence of their behavior, not a punishment born of malice. He had held up a mirror, and they had shattered themselves against their own reflection. "Chloe wants to see them," Liam said quietly. "She wants to try to build something new with them. A real relationship based on honesty this time." "And what do you think?" Beatrice asked. "I think it's her decision," Liam said. "But I told her that for me to be a part of it, there needs to be a genuine change, an acknowledgement of the harm they caused, an apology not for being caught, but for the cruelty itself. Redemption requires genuine remorse, not just a desire to get back into my good graces." He maintained his moral high ground, refusing to become the petty tyrant they had always accused him of being in their minds. His aunt smiled, a look of deep, abiding pride in her eyes. "That is the answer of a leader," she said. "Not just a CEO, but a truly good man. Your parents would be so proud of you, Liam." Liam felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. That was the only validation he had ever truly needed. He had honored his aunt. He had protected their family's legacy, and he had done it all without sacrificing his own integrity. The Davenports learned the hard way that you should never judge a book by its cover, and that true worth can never be measured by a bank statement or a job title. It's measured in character, in dignity, and in the quiet strength to be patient when you hold all the cards. The ultimate power isn't in showing everyone how strong you are, but in having the strength and never needing to prove it until the moment it truly matters. What do you think is the most important quality in a leader? Is it strength, integrity, or vision? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for joining us on this journey of vindication, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where character always wins the day.